Hi, Tahir.
Hi, Bob. How you doing?
How you doing? You sound amused.
No, I'm doing really, really well. I'm happy to have made it towards the end of this day. So it's been a crazy, chaotic day.
You're much closer to the end of your day than I am to mine
Thumbs
because you're in Morocco.
That's right. I'm in Casablanca, on the edge of Casablanca, where I live, and I've lived here for almost 10 years now.
And do you live in some kind of haunted mansion or something?
It's one of those crazy stories that makes for a really good, throwaway line. We live in quite a big house, a mansion actually, that was haunted with jinns, with genies, and
which are in Islamic belief, genies are kind of like demons, kind of, or kind of like little critters, kind of supernatural.
Yeah, but they
critters.
can be good and bad. They can be good and bad. You know, Hollywood recreated them, reinvented them as genies, which isn't really very accurate. Jinns can be really, really evil, or they can be quite nice and good. But this is a house that nobody wanted to live in, only a stupid foreigner like me, and I'm not Moroccan. I grew up in Britain. But I took on the house with my wife and kids, and we renovated it, and we had a grand exorcism, and we got 24 exorcists into the house, and they sucked the jinns from the walls and ate them whole. But that's another story.
Well, that's helpful. And was that to satisfy yourself? About the kind of supernatural sanitization of the house, or was it to just reassure neighbors?
Good. That's a good question. It was mostly to reassure neighbors, and the house came almost like an ancestral rite of sale. It came with these guardians and who kind of hang out in the garden and live in the stables most of the time, and they came with the house. Their families have worked here for centuries. And they said, it was the guardians who said, you've got to get an exorcism before you live in this crazy haunted mansion. And, I don't know, in the States or in Europe, if a house is empty for a long time, you get like squatters. But here in Morocco, you get jinns. It gets infested and haunted. Yeah. And there's only one solution, and that's to suck them from the walls and get them, eaten whole.
And do the jinns keep the squatters out, by the way? While the house is vacant? I would think that would be a disincentive for a squatter.
It is. It's the greatest way to keep a house really empty. Yeah. And because I grew up in England, as I said, and I know that if a house is empty for more than about 2 minutes in Britain, you get squatters, and squatters have rights, although the law just changed this week, and now they have less rights in Britain. But you can't get them out. And an amazing, maybe it was an ingenious landlord's way of keeping squatters out in the first place, 1,000 years ago in Morocco. But an amazing way to do it is to say that you have jinn in the property, and nobody would ever dare break in.
And does that supposedly happen with all properties left empty, or you have to designate it?
Yeah, no, it does. It does. And for that reason, you see quite a few abandoned houses, throughout Morocco. And this is a place where, people can't afford to have abandoned houses. But it's a crafty way, I think, that landlords use to make sure they don't get squatters of any kind.
Okay. Now, having fleshed out your surroundings, maybe I should tell people who you are. First of all, I'm Robert Wright of Blogging Heads TV, and this is an episode of Worldwise. You are Tahir Shah, and you are, as we said, in Casablanca. Now, we're going to talk a little bit about Morocco, but we also want to talk a lot about Mali, where you've been recently and which you've written about. First, I would like you to help me out with something. Your Wikipedia entry says you're an author, journalist, and documentary maker. I get all that. It also describes you as Anglo-Afghan Indian. Can you unpack that a little?
Hello. I can. And actually, I glanced, I don't know, I think everyone who's got a Wikipedia page glances at it from time to time. And I think what you tend to do if you've got a Wikipedia page is to try to see how much space you take up. So I was looking at my Wikipedia page the other day, looking at it, wondering if I was taking up enough space, or possibly if I could get some more entries in there. I would get someone else to, because of course, I mean, I don't touch my Wikipedia page.
No one would.
It's one of those terrible faux pas that you pass it to. So, but I saw that, and yeah, I come from this crazy sort of mixture of a family. My father was he was Afghan, but his mother was Scottish, and he was a writer, a Sufi writer called Idris Shah, and his work is very well known in the West. And my mother, my father's dead, very sadly, my mother, who's still alive, happily, is half Parsi Indian. And these were crazy Zoroastrians who fled Persia in, I don't know, the 6th century, 7th century, I think, when Islam took over Persia, or 8th century, and they made their way to India, and she's half British. So I grew up in this crazy sort of hodgepodge of a family, and I don't know, to me it's normality. And I should say, one of the things I love about North America is I never feel odd when I'm in North America.
Right.
I just spent summer driving across the States, and I can always explain to people, look, I'm a mixture of British, Scottish, English, Scottish, Afghan, and Indian. And Americans really understand it from the ground up. British people have a serious problem with it. So I love being in the States for that reason.
Okay, so your spiritual heritage includes Sufism and Zoroastrianism. Were you brought up in a particular tradition, and do you still adhere to one? No,
I wasn't really brought up in any tradition. We were taught, we were taught that our family, there's always, in a family like mine, I'm sure, and every North American who's got a mixture, there's always a dominant force that rises to the surface. And in my family, it was definitely my father's Afghan side. We were dressed in Afghan clothes and told we were Afghans, even though we grew up in Britain. And the reason I'm in Morocco now is because of my Afghan ancestry. My father could never take us. In the 70s during the war with Russia in Afghanistan, he could never take us to Afghanistan. So he brought us here to Morocco in a very sort of crazy Oriental way. He used to say, well, just imagine you're in Afghanistan. Or Morocco is very similar. It's got, mountains and deserts and tribal chiefs and clans. And of course, it's an Islamic country. But Morocco is on the westernmost fringe of the Islamic world, and Afghanistan is in the east. But I feel like the kind of person who could live anywhere, and I have 2 growing children, and I tell them, you inherit the world, and you have to, learn to live wherever life throws you. Okay. And it's a good thing to remember.
I agree. Okay, so you have been to Mali recently, and you wrote about it for, I think, Newsweek. I think for most Americans, they kind of know there's some trouble in Mali. Some of them may have heard that it could be linked to the Libyan war, that it may have been exacerbated by the aftermath of the Libyan war. But I think most people don't have a real clear idea of what's going on. That probably includes me. But I gather that, on the one hand, there was a coup in the kind of in the bulk of Mali, down where the capital is and everything. But then meanwhile, in Timbuctoo, which is in the north, there's a separate issue, which is that these kind of, I don't know if they're Taliban-like or Taliban, but they have come in, and some of them, I guess, came from Libya, and they've taken over, and it sounds like it's really not a place you'd like to live right now.
It's a funny thing, because I've written a book called Timbuctoo, and I'll come to that later.
That's a novel. But that's a novel, right?
It's a novel, and that's a whole other can of worms.
Yeah, we can talk about that, though, yeah.
Okay, we'll talk about it, but what was amusing, if there is anything. So, at the beginning of March, I desperately wanted to go to Mali and take a whole lot of journalists and friends and really revisit what was happening in Timbuctoo now. Mm-hmm. And a friend of mine here in Morocco said to me, well, okay, I can get you a meeting with the president of Mali in the palace, and I can get you free flights and free hotels, and it's all going to be fantastic and really good publicity for Mali. The next thing I know, I open the newspapers, and the president has been arrested, and there's a coup d'etat, and Timbuctoo is in free fall. And of course, this is Africa. I'm sitting in Africa right now. Distances are like the United States. They are massive. So Bamako, the capital of Mali, is a really long way away from Timbuctoo and Gao and the cities in the north. And that is a serious problem. So if you're sitting in the government if you're sitting in the government in the capital in Bamako, it's really hard to govern this entire country. And for a really long time, and I should say, Mali is going through one of those classic African kind of disintegration stories, that it's a huge chunk of Africa in itself, and it's really hard for the government sitting in the capital to keep their thumbs on what's going on everywhere. And what you always get in Africa, and I've been knocking around Africa for a very long time, or quite a long time, is you get tribal conflict, because Africa was chopped up by the Europeans in the 19th century, and they cut through tribal boundaries to suit their own needs. And that meant that a country like Mali, you've got various tribes, and you've got a very strong tribe called the Tuareg, who are in the north. And the Tuareg want their own country, and they've always wanted their own country for centuries and centuries, and they never had a hope in hell of getting it until now.
And is it the case that the people who have taken over in Timbuctoo they are of this ethnic group that you're describing, and does it so happen that it's members of that ethnic group that had been in Libya as kind of hired soldiers of Gaddafi's, and so after the government fell, they had occasion to come back to Mali with a bunch of weapons?
You've hit the nail on the head. Mm-hmm. But it's not just a bunch of weapons. It is everything from small arms, which isn't much at all, to, SAM 7 ground-to-air missile systems. What's happened is Libya collapsed as Colonel Gaddafi knew it, and Colonel Gaddafi got killed, of course, last year, and Colonel Gaddafi had championed the Tuaregs, and he had used them in his own militia to fight wars in Chad and other parts of Africa. And because Colonel Gaddafi had kind of seen himself, when he had been ostracized by the West, Colonel Gaddafi set himself up as this sort of number one brother of Africa. Mm-hmm. And he went around lending his Tuareg militia to kind of anyone who supported him in Africa. But what even worse than that was that you had an enormous amount of heavy weaponry, which suddenly flooded south through the Sahara, and it had to end up somewhere. So it ended up in Timbuctoo, literally. I mean, we say, as far as Timbuctoo, that's where it went, and northern Mali. And suddenly, all these militia they were battle-hardened, they had learned to use these weapons, and they weren't scared of a bit of war. So they realized, wow, suddenly, for the first time in our history, we're armed to the teeth, and we can try and get, independence for northern Mali, a Tuareg independence, which is exactly what they're doing. And before I rant on, what I should say is, you also hit the nail on the head. This is so reminiscent of the Taliban, and it is completely, in the pocket of Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda has been lending know-how, and it is Al-Qaeda's Western Front in Africa. And so it's a very, very scary thing.
So on the one hand, I mean, the origin of it sounds like lies much more in ethnic tension than in religious doctrine. In other words, you've got this ethnic group that wants its own region, and there's a history of tension between it and other ethnic groups in Mali. But now Al-Qaeda has kind of exploited this situation, I gather. And how prominent is the role of Al-Qaeda? I mean, how successfully have they commandeered this thing?
You're so right. I mean, as exactly what happened in Afghanistan. The Taliban at first weren't, I don't think I'm not a massive expert on the Taliban situation, but as far as I understood, the Afghan Taliban, Islam was a major thing, but Al-Qaeda turned it into a way of war. They turned it into this terrorism doctrine. And that's exactly what's happened with the militia, the Tuareg militia in Mali, who are called the Ansar ad-Din. And they are fighting this Islamic war. But what is, from my point of view, really awful, what they're doing, is they are taking a very hardline, sort of old-fashioned, obviously, version of Islam, and they're taking Islam back, to the Stone Age. They're taking Mali, this chunk of Africa, back to the Stone Age or before.
And Mali was Islamic traditionally, but a much less harsh form of Islam than these guys are advancing.
Right. So to give you a couple of examples, what's going on right now, is that if a man is found or thought to have had a relationship with a woman who was not his wife, he can be stoned to death. There was stoning the other day. Both the man and the woman were stoned to death by these Islamic sort of mullahs, these guys. And a guy found guilty of theft had his left hand cut off just the other day. I mean, this is stuff that is going on right now. And from my point of view, even worse. As someone who's so passionate about Timbuctoo, or as worse than that, they are destroying the monuments, as bad as that, destroying the monuments, the ancient Sufi and other monuments of Timbuctoo and other cities. So they are doing exactly what the Taliban did in Bamiyan with the Buddhas in Afghanistan. And it's the kind of thing that the world talks about later. But what I want to tell people is it's happening at this very moment. It happened today, yesterday, last week, and it's happening right now.
Okay, now tell me something. You know, with the Taliban in Afghanistan, I know one advantage they had was that there had been chaos before they came in. So while, you know, they made life sufficiently harsh that a lot of people didn't like them, there were some people who welcomed the stability, and that was a real asset for them. Was there a similar case in Timbuctoo where among the things these guys brought was order?
I think that's true to a point, and I think what always happens in situations where you have a new force arriving. I've read that when the Nazis, turned up on the scene, everyone was so grateful and happy, and they thought the Nazis were going to bring stability and happiness. That it just doesn't happen, and the only way to judge it is history. But right now, we can judge the situation by the present. The only thing is, all foreign journalists and aid agencies have been turfed out, have been thrown out of the northern part of Mali, and it's one of the most dangerous places in the world right now. So it's a very, very hard place to keep a tab on what's going on.
Okay. And tell me, what exactly does Al-Qaeda do for these guys in exchange for getting them to carry the Al-Qaeda brand? I mean, it sounds like they had plenty of weapons. They had their own ideology. They have the local knowledge. I mean, do you understand what exactly is the symbiosis between them and Al-Qaeda?
Al-Qaeda, from what I can understand, are fantastic at organizing themselves. And you've got a militia, an armed to the teeth militia, who've just come south from Libya, across the Sahara. They're fiending for blood. And what you've got an organizing force. And I hate what Al-Qaeda did in Afghanistan. I'm so against. They destroyed Bamiyan. They destroyed so much and so much culture in Afghanistan. And the same in Timbuktu and Mali. They're doing exactly the same. But Al-Qaeda is a very strong organizing force, and it's an umbrella under which sort of all kinds of factions come together. And that's happened in Afghanistan, and it's now happening in Mali as well.
Mm-hmm. And I guess there are no signs yet, presumably, that they're using this as a staging ground for terrorist attacks outside of Mali or anything, although obviously that's a long-term scenario that scares Westerners.
Good, and it should scare Westerners. I mean, it really should. How long is it going to be until there is, a mainstream Al-Qaeda or Al-Qaeda-esque attack on, Southern Europe, United States, Eastern Seaboard, or Northwestern Africa, where I'm sitting right now? I'm sitting from a hop, skip, and a jump from where you are. And a hop, skip, and a jump from me just south of here, okay, it's a few thousand kilometers maybe, but is an Al-Qaeda unit armed to the teeth. And it sends, shivers down my spine, and it should send shivers down every American's spine as well.
Now, the government, the army has, I gather, been routed when they've encountered these guys. The government of Mali, when they've tried to fight these guys, this Ansar Adin or whatever has lost. I gather there are attempts to gather militias that maybe would be more highly motivated than the army, although they're apparently not very well armed yet, to come fight these guys. Do you know anything about that?
Well, okay, let me say this. This is guerrilla war. So a paid army, a rank and file army who are the Malian army, sure, they can say, we beat them, just like the Americans have sometimes said, or the British have said in Afghanistan, we beat them. But then Taliban just melt away. They're not wearing sort of battle fatigues. They just put on, just regular civilian clothing. So I'm quite critical when people start claiming that they've beaten anyone at all. These are guys who have so much weaponry. I can't get over. I mean, they have weaponry, the kind of weaponry that, hard weaponry that can dig them in for years and years. And I just think they are such a threat to Western civilization. There hasn't been a big hit yet, so nobody's really listening to what I've got to say, except I hope your viewers. But it will probably happen. It's inevitable because Taliban want or Al Qaeda want one thing. They want to have another big hit. That's what they're geared up for. That's what they do. And the fact that they have a huge arsenal of weapons in northwest Africa, it just means it makes it all the easier for them, and they'll do it. It's just a matter of time.
But what you just described, I mean, the fact that it's guerrilla war and not a conventional army is what makes it hard to deal with, not just from the point of view of the Mali army, but from the point of view of anyone who would try to intervene from the outside, right?
This is one of those situations that is almost impossible to solve from the outside. It has to somehow be solved from the inside out. You know, the West could send ambassadors, the West could send, diplomats. It's probably not going to work. From Bamako, the Malian government can't sort it out. The only way that this sort of thing sorts itself out is when there's a power struggle within and they all shoot themselves dead or they run out of ammunition. I don't know if the first one may happen. They may have a power struggle. The Tuareg may get crazily bugged with the, with the Al Qaeda sort of group within its system. But Al Qaeda has a very, very crafty way at embedding itself in organizations like the Tuareg militia, the Ansar Adin, or like they did, exactly what they did in Afghanistan with the Taliban. I mean, I remember the Taliban, my sister made a film, Tahir Shah, my sister, made a film called Beneath the Veil, about women under the Taliban. Became very famous. And I used to ask her, I used to say, Syra, why don't the Taliban cut loose Al Qaeda? Why don't they just turn the Bin Laden in? And she said to me, no, it's like a parasite that has taken over a body. They cannot be separated. And that's exactly, I think, what you're getting in Mali. You're getting that the Al Qaeda are so ingrained in the unit, in the cell system of the Ansar Adin. This is, look, who am I to go on about this? But this is how I see it. I'm saying that they can't be detached, and hopefully it'll be a downfall for them both.
And do they have much local support? I mean, you said there is this a long-standing, I gather, indigenous ethnic desire to have autonomy, if not sovereignty, in that part of Mali, and that these guys have delivered, right? So,
exactly.
I mean, so to what extent, what extent is there local support for what's going on?
Well, again, that's a very cunning thing. It's a very popular bandwagon for Al Qaeda to pull through the streets, saying we're going to rid northern Mali of your masters in Bamako. We're going to set you up as an independent state Okay, it'll be a wild free-for-all, of course. And yeah, that goes down. It's how they got the ear of the crowd. But at the same time, when you start cutting people's hands off because they've stolen a loaf of bread or whatever it is, or you start stoning people to death, you turn the tables completely, and you begin to really, really disenfranchise the population. So what you've got happening in northern Mali right now, cities like Timbuctoo, you have the place turning into a ghost town. And we haven't talked about this yet, but what's happening in Timbuctoo, as I said, they're destroying these monuments, these Sufi monuments, they're wreaking havoc on the infrastructure of the place. But worse of all, the people of Timbuctoo and other towns are so terrified that there is one of the biggest unknown humanitarian crises on the face of the African continent happening right now, and everyone is heading, across to Mauritania or trying to get to the Ivory Coast or Burkina Faso or elsewhere. So you've got a situation where the place is becoming depopulated, and I don't know if that is a success story. I don't know if Al-Qaeda can claim success of any kind, or Al-Sa'adi, but because the place has been depopulated. Timbuktu is a virtual ghost town right now.
Mm-hmm. And is it possible to put your finger on particular signs of Al-Qaeda involvement in Timbuktu? I mean, are there, are there particular tactics or goals that these people would not exhibit on their own were it not for the Al-Qaeda influence, or can you not disentangle the two?
What I think is, and I may be wrong, but from having looked at the situation quite closely, I think what's happened is Al-Qaeda's form of Islam has rubbed off on Al-Sa'adi, on the Tuareg militia. I don't believe that this militia movement would be so hardline, sort of Islamic fanatics. This is a fanatical organization. You have to call it what it is. So when you start cutting people's hands off, when you start stoning people to death, when you start, destroying ancient mausoleums and monuments, and which were of Sufis. Sufis are this mystical sect within Islam. And this is getting Islam back to year zero. It's getting Islam back to this year zero. It's insane to any sort of moderate Muslims, but it makes no sense at all. I mean, it makes such little sense that most of the people who live in somewhere like Timbuktu or the other neighboring towns, they want to get out because they're so terrified they'll be killed.
And do we know how these guys originally got mixed up with Al-Qaeda? I mean, they went to Libya to be soldiers for Gaddafi. I guess they were dispatched to various other African countries in the course of events. And then there was this period of chaos in Libya during the not terribly long war, but and then there was the aftermath. Do we know at what point they became intermingled with Al-Qaeda?
I imagine they've been in the neighborhood for quite a long time. And look, I'm living in Morocco. If Al-Qaeda could get a foothold in a kingdom like Morocco, they would. Al-Qaeda is trying to sink its roots wherever it can, in Africa, in Asia, in Europe, United States, anywhere. It's like this, I see Al-Qaeda like this seed in the air, like pollen or something. It's trying to grab hold of anything it can. And certainly in a country like Morocco, Morocco has had a couple of bombs in the last decade, and I don't know if it's accurate that they've been put down to Al-Qaeda, because Al-Qaeda tries to get into the system. And just like you said, when a country is disintegrating or falling to bits, or it's got ethnic tensions and it's got a whole load of crazy weapons, that is the breeding ground for Al-Qaeda. And it's places like Mali or Afghanistan or Somalia, or Yemen, that Al-Qaeda comes up trumps every time.
Okay. But I gather, as alarmed as you are, the the problem seems sufficiently intractable, or at least not obviously easily soluble, that you're not calling for a particular kind of solution, right? Or are you?
You know, I've thought about this long and hard, and I don't see what the solution can be. All I know that works is to draw attention to it. So I wrote this piece recently about the Mali situation for Newsweek. It's in the current issue. And I think what works, I mean, and something I also think, what can someone like me do? Sort of schmuck like me, a writer. What I can do is I can write a piece to try and inform others what's happening. What really gets my goat is it's happening right now. And there's a huge convoy every day of refugees leaving northern Mali. We don't hear about it on the evening news because there's other stuff going on. And this isn't the sort of thing, you know, that people are really talking about. But to me, it's very, very important. Most of all because I've been wrapped up in Timbuctoo for a long time and been obsessed with it for 20 years.
Okay, well, speaking of that, can you talk a little about your novel, Timbuctoo? Maybe that will provide a somewhat refreshing contrast to the grim reality you just described.
I hope so. I hope so. Now I can smile and be a bit happier. But
lighten up. Yeah.
I can lighten up. Yeah, you know. Okay, so here's what happened. I said I've been obsessed by Timbuctoo for 20 years, and that's exactly right. So 20 years ago, in 1992, I was in a library called the London Library in London. It's got all these underground levels, and it's kind of a magical, spooky place. And I saw a manuscript, a book, an old book, propping up a water pipe. And I thought that's kind of weird, even for here. It had been propped up, sandwiched in there, so the pipe wouldn't leak. And it was a bit damaged with water. Pulled it down, I read it. And it was called The Narrative of Robert Adams, a shipwrecked sailor who visited Timbuctoo. And I read it. I became obsessed by it. And I decided that I would write a novel about it because this was one of the greatest lost stories of American exploration that there's ever been. And in a couple of lines, what the story is at a time 200 years ago, in 1812, the British, the Germans, the French, all the European powers worth their salt were desperately trying to get a Christian, a white Christian, to Timbuctoo. The only people not trying to get to Timbuctoo, because they were newly formed and couldn't really give a damn, were the fledgling United States. And so it was very strange when, in 1815, a shipwrecked, illiterate sailor named Robert Adams arrived on the streets of London, starving and half naked, it was snowing, and he said, "I've been to Timbuctoo." Everyone froze, freeze frame, and they couldn't believe the story. And he was coaxed, cajoled to narrating the story, which became the obsession of society at the time. And this story was published in this book, which I found propping up the water pipe, and it is the most remarkable story, true story of all time. It's the story of an illiterate American, as I said, Robert Adams, from Hudson, upstate New York, who set off to make his fame and fortune by trading. And he was shipwrecked on the west coast of Africa and taken as a white Christian slave into the desert, bartered time and again, and eventually he was taken to the king of Timbuctoo as a gift. And he lived in Timbuctoo for several months, and from what we know is he was the first Christian to ever go to Timbuktu. But
so the Americans beat all the countries that were trying to get a Christian to Timbuktu.
Hands down.
Although he didn't have quite the authority that the other countries probably wanted their Christians to wind up with, right?
Okay, bear in mind, the British, the Germans, the French, these great explorers in their own right, they were huge, towering names in exploration. They were set off from London, Paris, Berlin, elsewhere, in tweed coats, in completely the wrong with a completely wrong equipment. Most of them were never heard of again. Most of them were savaged, just when they got probably near Casablanca or something. And what I love is that the British were trying to, and the Germans, French, others, they were trying to sack Timbuktu because they believed Timbuktu was a city fashioned from the purest gold. They believed that the bedsteads and the cobblestones and the houses, the roof tiles, were made from gold. The only people, as I said, who didn't really care about Timbuctoo at all were the Americans. And Robert Adams turned up on the streets of London, and when he was asked about Timbuctoo, because he said, yeah, I've been to Timbuctoo, and I said, I've lived there with the king. He said, oh, it's a horrible place, you know. He said, it's a kind of place. He said, there's no treasure there at all. Later he recounted that, and when he was narrating his story, he said, there is treasure. There is white treasure. There is salt. And that drove everyone crazy. And he said, but salt is much more useful than gold because it keeps men and animals alive, of course, and it does. So it was incredibly unpopular. A, that he said there was no treasure and nothing to sack. And B, because he was an American, and an illiterate American at that. And C, because he was so handsome, all the British women fell in love with him. And so that bugged everyone no end.
As it should. And then did this... So there were huge deposits of salt there, I take it?
There, because it's a desert, there are dry salt pans. And...
But this didn't turn into some immediately thriving salt trade?
No, but, you know, I've seen it in Mali, I've seen it in Ethiopia, in Africa, in the eastern side. You quite often see these caravans of camels carrying big blocks of salt, which are just carved out, like cinder blocks out of the ground. They're salt, and they are what keeps everyone alive. I mean, you can't make too big a deal about it. Salt is important, and gold is distinctly unimportant. Gold is like the most rubbishiest thing of all if you're starving.
So this is like a heavily fact-based novel that you've written. It's historical fiction?
That's right. I've based it completely on Robert Adams' story. I'm known for my travel writing. I've written lots and lots of books about different countries and cultures and quests and that sort of thing. But I decided with this to fill in some of the gaps about Adams's story and his background. I needed to fictionalize some of it. So I fictionalized what I needed to, but where I could, I kept to the facts. And certainly the story of his narrative, I've kept to that as closely as I can. And there was a time, you know, when Britain had just lost the United States as a colony, and nothing about the United States wasn't really a very exciting topic to the British. The British just didn't want to hear about the United States, about the Americas, because it was like rubbing salt, to bring up
so to speak,
salt into the wounds of the British aristocracy, something deeply unpopular at the time.
And yeah, it was a little early, I guess, after the revolution to be beating them to Timbuctoo and doing humiliating things like that.
But you know what I find so amazing, Bob, is that Americans have forgotten about Robert Adams, and
I don't think we ever knew about him, to be honest. I mean, was there a time when he was well known?
He was well known because the narrative of Robert Adams, which I mentioned, popping up the water pipe, it was published in London in a really grand edition, really by the greatest publisher of the time, John Murray, printed by the greatest...
John Murray is the publisher that published The Origin of Species, by the way.
That's right. And
so when was this book published?
It was published in the beginning of 1816. And John Murray is my publisher, one of my publishers. And I know, what I love, it's so eccentric and so British. John Murray... they sold recently, but John Murray, the publisher, has always been owned for 250 years by a John Murray, because they always name the first son in every generation John. So I was published by John Murray of John Murray, and very sadly they sold the company. I was angry with them.
That is sad.
But then what I was going to say is, in 1817, a publisher in Boston reprinted the narrative of Robert Adams in a less fabulous edition, but it was printed up and down, you know, the eastern seaboard, as far as the eastern seaboard went in 1817, and it became very well known. But I spent this summer, as I said, in the United States, and really, it was a pilgrimage to me and my family to go to the town of of Robert Adams' birth, of Hudson, New York, And we went to this wonderful old whaling city, Hudson, and no one had heard of Robert Adams there at all. So, I don't know, I had a pang of sadness in my chest.
Well, maybe you will be the vehicle by which we rediscover Robert Adams. This thing sounds like it could be a movie or something. In addition to a best-selling book, of course.
I hope so. I don't know. Sometimes, at night when I can't sleep, which is quite often because I'm so stressed with life, and the situation in Mali, I think about who would play Robert Adams, and I don't know.
Who would play Robert Adams? Brad Pitt?
God, you took the name out of my throat. I always think Brad Pitt would just be fabulous for Robert Adams. I guess he's getting a bit old now, but I think he'd be great, or I don't know, Hugh Jackman or someone like that.
Well, if they don't want it, I'm available, okay?
I am too. I can do the American accent. I don't know. Maybe I can.
Yeah, I think I have an edge on you there. Okay, so before we go, can you tell us a little about Morocco itself, where you actually live? I mean, it seems to have escaped much of the turbulence of the Arab Spring, right? There were some stirrings for a time, but they seem to have subsided.
I've been living here for 8 or 9 years, and I'm really passionate about Morocco. I'm not Moroccan. I'm born and brought up in Europe, but I've seen Morocco is this fantastic crossroads of a country. Its roots are down in Africa, and the bowels, reach up to Europe and the United States, and over to the east we've got, North Africa and Asia. And Morocco is this kind of country that takes the best out of everything that's here, everything that's offered to it. As you said, it is a turbulent time in the neighborhood. We've had Tunisia, which kicked off the so-called Arab Spring. We've got the stuff happening down in Mali. We've got over in Egypt. I don't know what's ever going to happen in Algeria, but, it could happen there. It could flare up any day. Morocco has one advantage over all those countries. It's got the king. And the king of Morocco is this fantastic, I don't know, it's almost like a device to oversee corruption, he's like, I don't really know how to put it into words. I'm a huge fan of what he's doing, because if he ever sees that a minister steps out of line or someone, he can hold them to account like no one else can. And I think what you get in other countries is no one is held to account. So you get corruption spiraling out of control. You get all kinds of, problems and poverty and that sort of thing.
So there are less grounds for grievance to begin with in Morocco than there may have been in some other Arab countries?
I like to think that. And it's true that Morocco does need a lot more education, and it's got a very young population. Huge percentage is under 20, 25 years old. So it needs more focus on education. But it's got this system, the system that's, the Alawite, the royal family of Morocco have been in power for 300 years, I think. And it keeps the country, the kingdom, really grounded. And it means anyone, in theory anyway, has access to the royal court if they've got a grievance. And, all around, I didn't say this, but all around our house, we're living in this crazy mansion, this huge mansion called Dar Khalifa, the caliph's house. All around our house is a shanty town. And it makes it all the more special. And in the shanty town, I talk to people all the time. These are the poorest members of society. And they tell me that if they want to, and I know they have, they can go and they can get an audience with the king. And it's an extraordinary thing. I mean, if you think the United States, it's like turning up at the White House. And because there's an ancient medieval kind of structure to the society, anyone can do that. And it has a wonderful effect.
And the king did, in addition, right, at the beginning of the Arab Spring, make some concessions or give somewhat more power to Parliament or something?
I mean, well, largely to minority groups, especially women. I mean, this king, Mohammed VI, Mohammed M6 as we call him, he has championed the rights of women. And believe me, I'm not just spurting this stuff out. I've really watched it very carefully. And I was nervous at first. I tell you, God, we moved to this haunted mansion in the shanty town. My wife was saying to me, I remember she hit me on the face and said, you crazy? You spend all our money on this house that no one wants to live in. And over the years, we've all seen that there's a wonderful thing here that is going on. And, you know, it's centered around the family. In Morocco, you have, you know, there are no residential homes for old people. There's a family unit. And, for example, today is a Friday. So I was invited by a friend up the coast in Rabat to have lunch. I had lunch with his family. Every family on a Friday, if not every day of the week, they all meet and they have lunch or dinner. And the community is all there for each other. And it's something, you know, that in Europe we lost decades ago because cities are disintegrating and family unit structures are disintegrating. But here in Morocco, the core is really, really strong. And it's a wonderful thing.
Yeah. And I gather the monarchy there has a certain amount of support by virtue of the role it played during liberation from French rule, or do I have that wrong?
Absolutely. I mean, the French regarded Morocco as a protectorate rather than a full-on, you know, colony like Algeria was. And Morocco, you have to thank the French in one way. The French, the General Lyotet, who was in charge of the French rule here, he did something very, very, very good, which was he decided to leave the Moroccan cities alone and to build new towns, new French towns, next to all the big cities. So, for example, Marrakesh, which a lot of foreigners go to because it's fabulous fun, it has a new town and the old Medina, the old city. So does Fez, so does Meknes, so does Tangier, Casablanca. But that meant that the Moroccanness stayed, you know, the core unit, the Moroccanness stayed sharp. But to answer your question, you're absolutely right. The royal family was pivotal in the handover from the French and for the transition to the modern era, because in so many ways, although Morocco is on the doorstep to Europe, it, until recently, has been a medieval country. And, you know, just driving down just now from Rabat from this lunch, I saw farmers on their donkeys and old men in fields with scythes, you know, harvesting wheat. And I love that. I love that, that there's this mixture, and in so many ways it is medieval. But I don't know, it has the best, really the best of both worlds.
Yeah. Okay. Well, it makes me want to visit, I gotta say. And,
I hope you do.
If I do, you know, I may try to track down your haunted mansion.
Bring an exorcist with you.
But thanks for taking the time. And you know, it's distressing to hear what's happening in Mali, in particular in Timbuctoo. It is refreshing to hear about your novel Timbuctoo, which is a lot more fun to contemplate. And good luck with that.
Thank you so much.
And I really appreciate you taking the time, and I hope you'll come back and see us again.
Thank you. I really enjoyed it. Thank
okay,
you,
me too, Tahir. Take care.
Talk to you again. Thanks. Bye.